A few years ago, my friend Jake and I decided to spend a weekend in a remote cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. We were both into hiking and wanted to get away from the city noise for a while. We found this rustic cabin listed online. It was cheap, secluded, and surrounded by wilderness. A perfect retreat. The place was about an hour off the main road, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through dense forest. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked old but sturdy, a small wooden structure with a wraparound porch. Its windows were dark, reflecting the last glimmers of daylight. Inside, the cabin was cozy enough. There was no electricity, just an old wood stove for warmth and kerosene lamps for light. We unpacked, lit a fire in the stove, and settled in for the night. Outside, the forest was quiet. Too quiet, I realized. Not a single sound of wildlife, no wind rustling through the trees, just dead silence. Jake and I didn't pay much attention to it at first. We chalked it up to the isolation, a nice change from the constant city noise. As the night wore on, the silence became oppressive. It was the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every little creak and thud. Around midnight, we both heard something outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves, slow and deliberate. Jake and I exchanged glances, both trying to brush it off. "It's probably just an animal," he said, but the footsteps continued, moving closer to the cabin. My heart started racing. Jake grabbed a flashlight and I took a hunting knife we'd brought with us for camping. We stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line with the light. Nothing. The forest loomed dark and still. The footsteps had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. After a few tense minutes, we went back inside, locking the door behind us. I felt a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. We tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise, like something scraping against the cabin walls. I froze, listening intently. It was coming from outside, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging a stick or a blade along the wood. I nudged Jake awake, and he heard it too. We both sat there, wide-eyed, listening as the scraping circled the cabin. It started at one end, then moved to the other side, always slow, always steady. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be, but no answer made sense. After what felt like an eternity, the scraping stopped. We waited in silence, but nothing else happened. Eventually, we managed to fall asleep, though I kept waking up every hour, listening for any sign of movement. The next morning, we went outside to check for any signs of animals or people. There were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to explain the footsteps or the scraping. The air felt heavier, and the forest still unnervingly quiet. Jake suggested we cut the trip short and leave that afternoon. I agreed. Whatever had happened last night had left us both on edge. As we packed up, I noticed something strange near the front porch. There, etched into the wood, were deep gouges, like someone had deliberately scratched at the cabin with something sharp. The marks were erratic, spiraling around the corners of the building, stopping just under the windows. "Did you see this last night?" I asked Jake. He shook his head, his face pale. We would have noticed. The realization that someone, or something, had been that close to us while we were inside, unaware, sent a chill down my spine. We hurried to get out of there, loading our bags into the car as quickly as we could. The drive back felt endless. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig made me jump. We didn't speak much on the way, both of us lost in our thoughts, trying to process what had happened. We never found out who or what was outside the cabin that night. There were no signs of animals, no tracks, and the nearest town was miles away. The owner of the cabin claimed no one else had been out there for weeks. To this day, I still think about those footsteps and the scraping sound that circled the cabin in the dead of night. I've gone camping since then, but I always make sure I'm within reach of civilization. Something about that place was wrong, deeply, unsettlingly wrong. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that scraping sound in my head, wondering if it will ever return. A few years ago, I was on a long road trip across the Midwest. I had been driving for hours, and exhaustion hit me hard as I passed through a small, desolate town just before midnight. The only place to stay was an old, rundown roadside motel, the kind you only stop at when you have no other choice. The neon sign flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow across the empty parking lot. I pulled in, and the motel looked even worse up close. Peeling paint, cracked windows, and a general sense of neglect. The lobby was dimly lit, and the air smelled of stale cigarettes. A tired-looking man behind the counter handed me a room key without much conversation, his eyes barely meeting mine. My room was at the far end of the building. As I walked down the hallway, the carpet squished beneath my feet as if it had never fully dried after being soaked. The walls were thin, and I could hear muffled sounds from the other rooms. Voices, televisions, the occasional thud. But the hall itself was deserted, and it felt unnervingly quiet, except for the distant hum of the neon sign outside. I entered the room, and it was worse than I expected. The bedspread was worn and stained, and the furniture looked like it had been there since the 70s. The room smelled musty, but I was too tired to care. I locked the door and double-checked the windows, making sure they were secure. There was something off about the room, but I couldn't put my finger on it. After showering, I lay down on the bed, hoping to sleep off the unease. But then I heard it, a faint scratching sound like nails on wood. I sat up, listening carefully. It was coming from the wall behind the bed, just faint enough to make me question if I was imagining it. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an animal or old pipes. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. It moved from one side of the wall to the other, then stopped abruptly. I stared at the wall, my heart pounding, waiting for the noise to start again. When it didn't, I lay back down, but I couldn't relax. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a new sound, something heavy being dragged across the floor. This time, it was coming from the room next door. I froze, straining to listen. The dragging sound continued, slow and methodical, as if someone was moving furniture or something worse. I told myself it was nothing, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But then, there was a knock at my door. Not a normal knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps. My blood went cold. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for whoever or whatever was on the other side to leave. The knocking stopped, but I could feel someone standing just beyond the door. I held my breath, listening. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps slowly retreating down the hallway. I let out a shaky breath and decided I wasn't staying another minute in that place. I grabbed my bag, threw on my shoes, and quietly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, oppressive. As I hurried to my car, I glanced at the room next to mine. The door was wide open, but the room was dark. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took a quick look inside. The furniture was overturned, the bed ripped apart, and the window was shattered. But what sent chills down my spine was the writing on the wall, scrawled in what looked like charcoal. "You're next." I bolted to my car, drove off without looking back, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never reported it. I didn't even tell anyone about it for years. But every time I think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was waiting for me in that motel, and that if I hadn't left when I did, I might not have made it out.